Welcome to Game Matters, a channel about critically engaging with video games. Games are not just about distraction and empty entertainment. They can actually give us valuable insights into how the world works, and they often do this in a rather unique way. Consider Overcooked 2. At first glance, the game's whimsical appearance, its focus on social multiplayer and over-the-top gameplay, suggest mainstream appeal and a strong focus on entertainment. I mean, in the game we need to save the Onion Kingdom from the ravenous unbred by cooking dishes and serving customers fast enough to meet arbitrary time limits. Clearly, Overcooked 2 doesn't have anything to say about the real world, right? Well, but it does. It actually does present a strong and coherent argument about the real world, and repeatedly so. The argument is as compelling as it is straightforward. If you want to succeed, you must communicate efficiently with one another. This sentiment is reflected in every gameplay moment. In order to beat a level, let alone get a 3-star rating, efficient communication is paramount. It could easily have been otherwise, but Overcooked 2 goes to great lengths to create and emphasize opportunities for proper communication. And it does this mostly on the systemic, rule-driven level rather than through verbal or visual prompts. For example, kitchens are usually set up extremely inefficiently, which usually means the players have no choice but to coordinate their actions tightly with their team members. Kitchens are also ever transforming, which is a clever trick to hinder players from establishing fixed routines or taking on fixed roles too easily. And the limited number of kitchen utensils need to be carefully managed and shared across all team members. The existence of these and other system-level factors hammer home the same message. If you want to succeed, you must communicate efficiently with one another. And it should be easy to see how the implications of this argument extend far beyond the boundaries of the game itself. This isn't just good advice for the game, it's sound advice in general. Games are perhaps uniquely suited to making claims about the world using procedural rhetoric. Procedural rhetoric. That is a term and concept coined by academic and video game designer Ian Bogost. Let's examine it more closely. The procedural in procedural rhetoric does not refer to the procedural generation of game content, or the procedural programming paradigm, or any kind of bureaucratic procedures. Instead, for our purposes, we can think of a procedure, or really a process, as something that simply defines certain rules and constraints to allow and deny specific play experiences. For example, in Overcooked 2, you can move your character around, but you cannot jump over obstacles. You can throw raw food, but not fried food, which needs to go on a plate. You can put food on clean plates, but not on dirty ones. Or on a more general level, the game's rules afford you to cook and serve some specific dishes in some specific ways, but not in other ways. And you certainly cannot, participate in go-kart races or shoot people or something like that. You could say that in Overcooked 2, the procedures or processes in place lend themselves well to chaotic and cooperative kitchen action, but not so much to other kinds of gameplay experiences. Here's another way to think about procedures and processes. When painters create a new painting or writers come up with a new story, they are directly involved in the authoring process of the final product. Game developers, on the other hand, only indirectly author the final play experiences. They use code to define the rules and constraints of the game, its procedures, which are then executed by the computer to produce the final play experience, which of course will be made up of a unique set of variables for every playthrough. Now, the term rhetoric comes with a fair share of baggage too. When we hear rhetoric, we may think of double talk, of pretentious language or expressions like empty rhetoric. But this does the discipline of rhetoric injustice. At a fundamental level, rhetoric is a specific form of communication. Rhetoric is all about effective persuasion or the effective expression of an idea. So, successful rhetoric causes a change in opinion or in action, or it focuses on communicating an idea as elegantly, clearly, creatively, and vividly as possible. When we have a conversation with someone or give a presentation or speech, We may use spoken rhetoric to persuade them of something or express an idea.
You know, there's a book I read a long time ago. Still think about it every day. It helps me understand life out here. The book talks about men, about what motivates them. Simple, really. A living being seeks above all else to discharge its strength. Life itself is will to power. Nothing else matters.
We can use written rhetoric in text-based conversations or literature to do the same thing, or we can make use of visual rhetoric and skip natural language altogether. I think it's rather obvious that video games can and often do contain all of these types of rhetoric in some form or another. But it's another kind of rhetoric, the procedural kind, that comes to video games most naturally. Ian Bogost even goes so far as to say that when games make arguments about the world, they do so through processes exclusively. So we speak of procedural rhetoric when processes are used for persuasive or expressive purposes. Overcooked 2, our example from earlier, does exactly that. It uses its processes, so its rules and constraints, to persuade you of the value of effective communication. Far Cry 2 is another game that I think mounts a very persuasive procedural rhetoric. Doing an in-depth analysis would take too much time, but I think a few examples will get the point across. One example is how soldiers in Far Cry 2 are easily replaceable. It doesn't matter how often we clear out some outpost or roadblock, we will be greeted by the bullets of a fresh batch of soldiers again when we return later. No matter how often we clear a camp or how many soldiers we kill, there will always be more. There is an endless supply of soldiers out there. People's lives don't count for much in the war-torn world of Far Cry 2. They can be killed and swiftly replaced. We can also notice that no matter what we do, the fighting never stops. You complete missions, you progress through the game, you cause immense destruction and kill a frankly ridiculous number of people. But to what end? No matter how much violence you enact and how strongly you dominate your enemies, the war and the fighting just won't stop. Your actions actually make things even worse. Hyper-violence and dominance fail the player. The game frames these behaviors as invalid solutions. There's much more that can be said about Far Cry 2's procedural rhetoric about war, like how the unrealistically fast weapon decay, the malaria gameplay mechanic, and respawning soldiers are meant to frustrate the player, or how the game treats both factions as completely interchangeable on a story and gameplay level. But I think the point gets across. Far Cry 2 makes it very clear what it thinks of war. It establishes many rules and constraints that ultimately reinforce a grueling and highly pessimistic view of war and hyperviolent behavior, both in-game and by extension in real life. Far Cry 2 is a very persuasive game. It would be interesting to examine the procedural rhetorics of other Far Cry games and see how they compare to Far Cry 2's, but this is a task I'll leave up to you. Now, almost all games employ a procedural rhetoric of some kind. This makes sense if you think of games as bundles of procedures or processes that are interconnected and layered on top of each other. But there are, of course, games that use procedural rhetoric much more effectively than others. Here are some points to consider when examining the quality of a game's procedural rhetoric. Number 1. Procedural rhetoric is specifically concerned with how games make claims about the real world through processes. A claim may address material aspects of our world, like war, or conceptual ones, like teamwork. Games contain lots of processes that don't necessarily have any persuasive content. Not all games are persuasive. Consider some procedural elements in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Consider how at the start of a race, if you press and hold the A button when the timer hits 2, you will get a short boost. Or how each additional coin you hold increases your kart speed by a little bit. Or how if you shoot green shells, they just go in a straight line, while red shells seek out the nearest kart driver, and blue shells always go for the kart in the top position. None of these rules make any coherent or convincing claims about the real world. They just reference the logic of the game world. They are entirely self-referential, and hence, per definition, they are not part of a procedural rhetoric. In fact, as far as I can tell, the totality of Mario Kart 8 Deluxe has an almost non-existent procedural rhetoric. But games don't just make up fantasy rules, of course, they can also procedurally represent things from the material world. For example, the day and night cycle in Far Cry 2 is a simplified model, a procedural representation, of the day and night cycle of the material world. Just like the fantasy rules in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, the rules that make up the day and night cycle in Far Cry 2 don't make any persuasive claims about the world, so they are not part of a procedural rhetoric either. That being said, games can have a strong procedural rhetoric even when this may not have been directly intended by the game developers. Certain cultural, social, political, or other kinds of values may have influenced the development of the game in such a way that it unwittingly or inevitably makes a persuasive claim about the world. Bogost's background is in advertising, education, and politics, which can help us understand where his definition of procedural rhetoric comes from and where he wants to go with it. Number 3. Just because a game makes a claim about the world doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's an opinion, an argument put forward. It can be embraced, partially accepted, criticized, or rejected, among other things. Number 4 and 5. These are not necessarily requirements, but a strong link between the visual appearance of a game and its procedural arguments, and meaningful, sophisticated interaction both help increase the quality of the procedural rhetoric of a game usually. Number 6. Not all parts of a game must support a specific procedural rhetoric in order for the overall argument to be effective. The unbred of Overcooked 2 and the day and night cycle in Far Cry 2 say hi. Number 7. Procedural rhetoric is not unique to video games. You can find it in other technology, in board games, bureaucratic processes, in the law, and in many other places. But because of games' fundamental procedural makeup and the fact that games are an expressive medium at heart, they are perhaps uniquely suited to making persuasive claims or expressing ideas through processes. With that out of the way, here are some more examples of games that make persuasive procedural arguments. Plague Inc. Evolved by Endemic Creations neatly visualizes the hidden processes of how germs spread. Democracy 3 by Positech Games presents a particularly effective, if extremely simplified, procedural model of policymaking. The McDonald's video game by Molly Industria is an effective critique of McDonald's business practices. And Off-World Trading Company by Mohawk Games lays bare the procedural logics of the capitalist free market. Games can also make claims about the world on a smaller scale. For example, Counter-Strike Global Offensive punishes players who shoot at hostages or team members in certain instances. The value of teamwork is also emphasized, although to a lesser extent than in Overcooked 2 and primarily only in the competitive mode. And, at least in theory, it is possible to complete a round without shedding a single drop of blood. While I don't think that these smaller claims about the value of allies and hostages, about teamwork and goal-oriented gameplay, add up to a larger, coherent argument about the world, there are still some of these smaller scale claims present in the game. The concept of procedural rhetoric offers us a way to examine and appreciate video games more thoroughly and to better understand how they work on a deeper level. And video games that mount an effective procedural rhetoric can also help us understand our globalized and interconnected world better. We are surrounded by complex systems and complex challenges like war, globalization, or capitalism. Games are really good at modeling such systems, and they can help us comprehend them in more nuanced and authentic ways than perhaps other media can. And that's it! If you want to find out more about procedural rhetoric, I highly recommend Ian Bogost's book from 2007 called Persuasive Games: The Expressive Power of Video Games. The first chapter is available for free online, as are some other resources linked in the description below. So go check that out. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and perhaps you also learned one or the other thing. If you found the video interesting or useful, I'd really appreciate it if you share the video with others. And you can also hit that like button, of course. Did I get you thinking? I would love to read about more games that use procedural rhetoric in the comments below. Until next time.